Welcome everyone. My name is Joy Davidson. I'm with the Digital Curation Centre in the UK, and I work for the FAIRsFAIR project. And we want to welcome you all to this, the latest in the series of FAIRsFAIR repository support webinars. These webinars have been scheduled to try and share some of the lessons learned coming through the FAIRsFAIR project. And ultimately, we're hoping to help repositories to become more FAIR enabling. So today's session, no coincidence that it has been arranged on World Preservation Day. So happy International World Digital Preservation Day. Today's session is going to focus on sharing a little bit of practical information from the FAIRsFAIR repository certification support program, and primarily to share with you a little bit of information on the core trust seal certification requirement around digital preservation. We'll also have a little bit of a case study with one of the supported repositories. While core trust seal obviously is a certification standard for those of you who maybe don't know that much about it, it's there to try and assess the trustworthiness of repositories. And a key emphasis of core trust seal is on digital preservation. As a core function of a trustworthy repository. Oops, just see if I can progress my slides. So essentially, what we're hoping that you'll get from today is whether you're looking to become core trust seal certified or not. As digital preservation is a core function of any repository, and particularly playing a huge role in keeping data fair over time, we're hoping that after today's session, you will get a little bit of an understanding of the support program that we've put together in the FAIRsFAIR project to help some repositories to take their journey to become more fair enabling. We hope you'll have a better understanding of how core trust seal criteria relate to digital preservation. And we hope that when you'll hear from one of the supported repositories, you'll get a little bit of some of the tips on things that you might want to consider when you're looking at addressing digital preservation in your own institution, and get some practical advice in that respect. So just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded for those of you who have just joined. You should be getting prompted to accept that. So if you don't want to be on camera, then please don't put your camera on or unmute. Before we go into the session for today, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on the FAIRsFAIR project. We are a Horizon 2020 funded project. We've been running since March 2019. We're a large project. We've got 22 partners, and we are actually in the last few stages of our work. We finish up in just a few months in February 2022. The emphasis of FAIRsFAIR is really on trying to help support the emergence of a fair data ecosystem and a culture where there are the adoption of good practices. A key stakeholder for us are repositories as part of that ecosystem. And the ultimate aim of the project is really to help realize the vision of the European Open Science Cloud. So that's a little bit about the FAIRsFAIR project. We have quite a lot of our activities are dedicated towards helping repositories to become more fair enabling. So we have 3 work packages where repositories are key stakeholders that are addressed. One is looking primarily at semantics, interoperability, and vocabularies. The one I lead, which is data policy and practice, and the one that you'll be hearing about today, which is the certification of repositories. So this particular work package has been working to support 10 repositories to work towards core trust seal certification, and as part of that, looking at digital preservation specifically. So that's a little bit about the FAIRsFAIR project and what you're hopefully going to get out of today. But what we'd like to do now, before we move on to the presentations, is just to get a little bit of information about who's in the audience today. So if we can ask you to go to menti.com and enter the code 1855-8969, we will just get a little bit of information about you. Stop sharing that and go to my my next thing and start sharing again, hopefully. Okay, so as I mentioned, if you can go to menti.com and enter code 1855-8969 and let us know which of these options best describes your service. Are you a national repository, an institutional repository, domain-specific repository, metadata aggregator, or other? And maybe for some of the others, if you want to, feel free to put your stakeholder type in the chat, that would be great. At the moment, it looks like most of the participants are coming from the institutional repository side, so that's great to see, because I think quite often we see a lot of digital preservation planning happening at the domain-specific and national level, and it's great to see that there's interest at this at the institutional level as well. So I think we've got a pretty good sense of who's in the room now, so I'm going to move on to the next question I have for you. And it's whether you have developed a digital preservation policy for your repository service at this point. So if yes, no, or other, if either of those options fit for you. So it looks like many of you have already taken steps along this journey and have something in place. Quite a lot of you, neck and neck actually, are in the position of not having developed a preservation policy. So that's quite good to see. And a few others who are in the other category. And again, if you're happy to share some information on what that means, we'd be delighted to see that in the chat. So I think it's good to see that we've got people who have policies in place who are maybe coming today to get a few pointers on how to become more FAIR enabling in relation to their digital preservation policy. And for those of you who don't have a policy in place yet, hopefully some of the information you'll get today will help you to start taking that journey. One last question from us, and it's just for those of you who have started or who do have policies, and some of the people who maybe are starting this and would like to share some of the issues that you're facing when trying to come up with a preservation policy. So are there any challenges or any things that have given you some difficulties as you start this process or in the process that you've done previously? And feel free to just enter things into the chat. And I think keeping things up to date is definitely, I think, a challenge. Things change very quickly. I think over the last few years, we've seen really big shifts in the landscape. So keeping up to date is very difficult. I think this point about what is long-term, excellent point. That is very much to be decided by the communities of practice who are involved. File formats, yeah, very, very key issue in terms of what you can do with preservation. Money, always a big problem, and time, definitely all of these things are things we're hearing from others. So definitely, I think we're seeing some things that hopefully will get picked up during the discussions today. So yeah, some great points there, and choosing the right software systems to use and getting some support and solutions. So that's great. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand over, and we can start with the actual meaty part of today's session. So today you're going to have 3 talks. The first is going to be from my colleague Lena Sapinskis from DANS, and he's going to give you a bit of an overview of the FAIRsFAIR repository certification support program to let you know what we've been doing. Then we'll hear from Hervé Lours from the UK Data Service, who is also part of the FAIRsFAIR project. He's going to give you the overview of the core trust seal certification criteria that relate to digital preservation. And then finally, you're going to hear from Miguel Gelabert, who will, he represents the data center of the Balearic Islands Coastal Observing and Forecasting System. And he is one of the supported repositories that we've been working with in FAIRsFAIR. And he's going to give you his practical take on this whole process and give you some tips and pointers to consider. So as we go through, please feel free to ask any questions. in the chat or comments, and we will try to come back to these later if we have time. One note to say that the slides are already available on the FAIRsFAIR website, so if you want to have a look at those, by all means, take a look. So at that, I will now hand over to you, Lena, and you can take over for now.
Thank you, Joy, very much. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to those of you in different time zones. I will shortly share my slides. Can everyone see it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
Perfect. Thank you very much. My name is Lina Shapinskas. I work at DANS, which is the Dutch National Center of Expertise and Repository for Research Data. We're based in The Hague in the Netherlands. And today I will be giving a short preview of the FAIRsFAIR support program for repositories. So, supporting data repositories on their journey towards achieving Core Seal and FAIR is at the heart of FAIRsFAIR project. In this picture, you can see different elements that are important to take into consideration here. Open data and data management policies calling for continuous access and preservation is something that is becoming commonplace across the global research community. In this case, also digital repositories play a very important role in the long-term preservation of research data. And research also data being more fair. This process is a two-way process. So research data repositories that take part in the FAIRsFAIR support program, they get the tools, expertise, and feedback from experts that support them on their journey towards achieving Core Seal certification and becoming more FAIR enabling. On the other hand, the support program for repositories receives the also important know-how and valuable expertise of how FAIR enabling practices work in different repositories and how to achieve them. And also, this also enables the project to share guidelines, tools, to support other repositories on their journey towards becoming more trustworthy and FAIR enabling. Our support team, here you see the map of Europe, and we are quite a diverse team, and I'm trying to play the countries. So we have different organizations across 4 countries in Europe, which is DANS, UK Data Archive in the UK, CINES in France, DCC in the UK, and Pangea in Germany. Together, these organizations, they offer different services in digital data preservation, archiving, and so forth, and they are also supporting the digital repositories in the program. Who we work with? The geographical coverage of repositories is quite diverse. We have 10 different data repositories, stretching from the north in Sweden to the south in Spain, and from the UK to Bosnia-Herzegovina. So we have a variety of digital repositories representing national repositories, discipline-specific repositories, and so forth. Here you can see an overview of the different repositories that take part in our support program. Throughout the program, we have delivered a number of services, and also this is thanks to the participating repositories for their valuable feedback and input. Besides support workshops, which were organized to help repositories share their practices, clarify questions, they address specific issues that repositories had. We also delivered a number of tools, such as roadmaps, such as digital preservation long-term planning tools and worksheets, and so forth. And they also had one-on-one consultations, and as well as writing sessions to practice for applications for Core Seal. There are some other tools that may be relevant to some of you here. Within FAIRsFAIR project, we have been also involved in creating some tools to support researchers and data stewards. One of the tools is FAIRsFAIR, showcased here on the left. It's available online, and it's something that can be useful before depositing a data set into a repository. And on the other hand, we have also Fuji, which is automated fair data assessment tool for repositories to check the level of fairness of data sets. You will see also the links at the end of the presentation. Here you see the timeline or the support program as we stand. We're currently in November, and we have just had our final support workshop yesterday with celebrating achievements and also marking the milestones of repositories submitting the applications to CoreTrust Seal. The next steps will be one-on-one interviews with each repository, clarifying lessons learned and also sharing good practices, and also taking that input for the next future projects in this domain. And the project will be closed in March 2022. Support program is not in isolation from other initiatives and similar events. This is something that I would like to also stress here. FAIRsFAIR support program for repositories had also been quite a big actor in uniting the voices and also participating in different initiatives globally. One of them is the Enabling Fair Data CoreTrust Seal cohort, ARDC in Australia, Portage Network in Canada, and so forth. The goal behind this cooperation and working together was sharing experiences and lessons learned, and in this way also supporting other repositories across the world with good practices, guidelines, and examples on how they can be more fair enabling and trustworthy. Here on this slide, you will see the links to some of the practical tools that I just mentioned. There are links. For FAIRware tool, I forgot to mention, there's also a French version available, thanks to our collaboration with our French partners. And there's also Fair Data Forum being mentioned there, which is a very recent gateway to fair data practices and services. Feel free to visit it in case you have questions on fair matters. And also on certification support program, you will see some latest publications from our support program and from within the project wider group. Thank you very much. Feel free to reach out to me in the chat or via email.
That's great. Thanks very much, Linus. I don't know if anybody has any initial questions during the switchover, but we're happy to take any. And I think one of the nice things about the support program is that it does focus on bringing people together and that sharing of experiences, because I think so often learning from your peers and how they're going through the same process is really useful. So that's great. Thanks very much. Okay, next up, we are going to move on to my colleague Hervé Lours, who is from the UK Data Service and also part of the FAIRsFAIR project. And he's going to give us a little bit of a more detailed explanation now of how CoreTrust Seal fits in with digital preservation. So over to you, Hervé.
Thanks very much, Joy. Hi, everyone. Yeah, just a brief overview from the CoreTrust Seal perspective of digital preservation here. But I'll kind of briefly start with maybe the foundations and layers that this kind of all fits into. I think generally the area that we work in is pretty focused on primarily kind of reducing the long tail of at-risk data that we've got out there in the world. And there are multiple tiers to move up to, and all of them very valuable for what we do prior to the level of digital preservation. Moving out of the risk phase and into the technically managed static bits, up into the more generous preservation phase, looking at the specific needs of objects and how they interact with users. And then that other tier, the specialist preservation, disciplinary or domain preservation, especially for the long term. And behind that, we've got a range of supporting software tools and services that we all need to take account of. So having looked at that tiers of storage, curation, and preservation, I'm going to go over the CoreTrust Seal process itself, some of the work on CoreTrust Seal plus FAIR and capability maturity that's been happening on the FAIRsFAIR project, including the issue of evidence. And then look at the CoreTrust Seal requirements themselves in the context of some of the mandatory responsibilities that we're expected to adhere to, and then focusing on those specific requirements around mission, designated community, appraisal, reuse, and finally preservation. So briefly, the core trust seal process itself, there are 16 core trust seal requirements. A repository undertaking self-assessment then has that peer reviewed. That goes through to a board decision, and you achieve core trust seal status. And something we've been looking at with FAIRsFAIR is how this interacts with FAIR, and Linas has already spoken about specifically about some of the FAIR object testing that's taking place, which is of interest here as well. But this is more the other side, FAIR enabling, how a repository or another data service enables FAIR data by providing the right context for fairness. And it's pretty clear from the FAIR principles and the FAIR indicators that have been developed by the RDA group looking at this, that we need to acknowledge that the objects themselves need to be considered in their wider context. So ideally, we'd like to see a way of looking at core trust seal plus FAIR and eventually pulling repository status related to both of these things into some kind of longer term registry. I won't go through these in detail here, but we have taken through a mapping between the two. There'll be references at the end related to this to try and make that a slightly easier process. But repositories have got a fairly fundamental focus on findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and have for a long time. And the last thing I'll briefly mention about the FAIRsFAIR work there is that we've also looked at core trust seal plus FAIR in terms of a capability maturity model, looking at different areas of focus within the repository, specifically with an angle on evidence, the evidence you need to prove that you're FAIR enabling or providing evidence for core trust seal requirements, moving out through initial, managed, and defined, which should be sufficient, through to the broader ambitions of qualitatively managed and optimizing. But back to the core trust seal itself. As I said, there are 16 requirements. These are broken up into organizational infrastructure, digital object management, and technology. And I'll drill down into the more specific requirements today. But the idea is that all of these are the organizational foundation around which we deliver a service, not purely preservation, but a range of other curation and data quality related services. So these are all necessary underpinnings, but for today we'll look at those hopefully in a coherent way that takes us through the preservation specific angles. And this all sits within the context as all of the trustworthy digital repository requirements do, the different standards, the ISO standard, DIN 31644 in Germany, within the mandatory responsibilities of an OAIS, according to the OAIS reference model, negotiating and accepting information from a data producer, documenting your policies and procedures, vital for evidence in the case of core trust seal, demonstrating sufficient control for long-term preservation, the perennial rights issue, and then defining your designated community and ensuring that what you do is you make the data available, you assure its authenticity, and you make it independently understandable. So that's the kind of background context of responsibilities. We'll start off with R1, which is the repository mission. Access is explicitly required by core trust seal, but it's important to remember that a trustworthy digital repository does go beyond the bits. Write a mission statement, reference preservation and curation specifically, and then demonstrate approval and buy-in. A lot of the evidence that's on the core trust seal has more confidence. This is a public statement eventually, which is out there in the world. A lot of the evidence will look a lot better if it's clear that it is managed, approved at a sufficiently senior level. And as for all the evidence, it's really important that wherever possible, you can make this public. You can have private evidence on core trust seal if something's sensitive, but part of core trust seal is about openness and transparency. And one of the benefits is that we all see each other's peer efforts at this and learn from each other as well. So deposit, curate, preserve, access, and use as your mission. And you're doing that for a designated community of users. The diagram here shows the wide range of what we usually think about of our public and private audiences. We've got our reviewers, our review boards in terms of the privacy of the core trust seal application, but we all deal with peers and partners and depositors and funders as well as our users. But the focus of a designated community is to define a subset of those overall users who really need to understand and be served by your data. What provenance do they need? You know, what access information do they need? And certainly for more disciplinary people, what additional metadata and descriptive information do they need? So understanding their knowledge base, understanding their processes and methods, and having a handle on the technologies that they use and that you need to deliver a service to them. Appraisal in RA is an important consideration here because it's the gatekeeper to the repository. The objects that are offered for deposit are evaluated by the repository, and this is the point that curation and preservation actions are defined. And that entry point is pretty vital here. And at the other end of the scale, on the other end of the process, we've got reuse. It's the R in FAIR, and it's the ultimate outcome of what we're all doing. So we take actions to make sure that a user can understand for reuse, but also so that they can integrate data into their other work, rerun, repeat, reproduce, or replicate prior work. And these are all the means by which we deliver impact through these research data. So it is the ultimate outcome for now. We do at the moment make this independently understandable to our designated community. We make it available, we assure authenticity, we define the provenance, we understand our users' methods, the technology, tools and formats that they require, and their metadata, the metadata they need and that we need in terms of descriptive, technical and rights. And that makes it fair now. The trick is to ensure reuse over time, to provide long-term preservation and to make things fair into the future. The key considerations here are what changes and what actions do we need to take in response to those changes. So a lot of preservation does come down to understanding the need for change in response to the needs of the designated community, which are sometimes driven by kind of wider technical issues, but it's about the people, disciplinary communities with more specific needs, especially processes, what the research focus is and the practices that change over time, and the technology, the general environment and the specific designated community technical environment. You know, what do they need? Various types of tech watch can help you follow this, but in general, ask your community and act on what you find. Find a good way to do that, to build a relationship with your community and make sure you're serving their needs. Now, how you provide evidence for that is another matter. Quite often this is referred to as a preservation plan. You'll see guidance on preservation strategies. You'll have a number of procedures to demonstrate that you do what you do, or this might be very policy driven. The Core Trust Seal is interested in the content and not the label. Yeah, fundamentally, you'll have to be doing the things that we've talked about here. You won't have to call it a particular thing. If it's in 10 documents that you pull together, that's fine. If it's all wrapped into one, that's fine. It really is the content as opposed to the label that you're looking for supporting evidence here and across Core Trust Seal. So in brief, for preservation, we need to define, communicate and respond to our designated community of users. Specify their preferred or required data formats, metadata schemas and content, and think through the descriptive information that's necessary for their understanding. And that will change over time as that designated community changes over time. Identify the preservation risks, which are of course quite often preservation opportunities as well. Functionality can increase as well as decrease based on our actions, and plan for those preservation actions to continue meeting those needs. And then communicate those changes. That's the repositories part of the mission, to provide clear provenance with our data. And with that brief overview, that's all from me.
That's great. Thanks very much, Hervé. I think that was really helpful to see the kind of drilled down view of what Core Trust Seal and the expectations around data preservation are. I think I don't know if you'll maybe need to stop sharing your screen, and then our next speaker might be able to load up his presentation. I think just one thing I wanted to pick up in your presentation that I thought was really worth emphasizing, this importance that you put on consulting the designated community and that kind of communication role. And I think it's important not to forget when you're doing any of this kind of preservation planning, it's not just your internal processes, but really doing that wider consultation. And so that was a really good point, I think, that you brought up there. Okay.
Yeah,
So
I think we're all really close to our communities quite often, but there's always more to be done, I think.
yeah, that's great. Thanks very much. Great. So as I said, if you have any questions or comments that you want to put in the chat, we'll collect them for a little bit later. But for now, we will move on to the last speaker of the session today. And this is Miguel Gelabert, and apologies if I've given your name butchering. Miguel is joining us as one of the representatives of the repositories we've supported in FAIRsFAIR, and he's been working towards Core Trust Seal certification. And he is going to give us a sort of blow-by-blow account of his experience of going through this process. So I will hand over to you, Miguel.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, as Joy said, my name is Michelangelo Rúcula, and I'm a senior software engineer in the data center in SOCIP. Today, I'm going to give you an overview of our experience through the whole process of the certification, but specifically regarding the preservation, the digital preservation issues. So basically, I'm going to start giving you some context. Then I'm going to talk about the specific things that we had to tackle with regarding our data. Then I'm going to talk about an overall of the certification process and give you some tips or some things that we found useful. And then I'll talk about the results and expectations we have. So what's SOCIP? We are a multi-platform ocean observing and forecasting system. And that means that we are a public research institution. We are a consortium formed by the Spanish Ministry of Science and Innovation, the local government of the Balearic Islands, and recently the National Research Institution in Spain, which is the CSIC. SOCIP is the three main drivers are the science, the technology, the development, and also the society needs. All our data is most of our data is free and open, and this is an overview of what we do. We do research. We do operational oceanography. We have many different platforms and instruments, sensors, and on the Western Mediterranean that gather information, different types of meta-ocean information, which are, let's say, chlorophyll, oxygen, air pressure, and so on. So all these instruments have different formats, and those formats are our input data. So our repository is a compound of these different types of data. So our main challenge is to that we receive data from different instruments, and those instruments come from different manufacturers, and each one has their own needs and their own formats. So there isn't a standard input format for us. But scientists, which are our main users, need a common file format to work with, and this is the NetCDF format. And here you have two examples of input data that we receive. They are mainly ASCII files. So to give you an overview of how we work, we receive these different types of formats. They they are sent to our data center in Palma, in Mallorca, and we have a software developed by us that parses and converts and standardizes this data using the configuration we have in a central database, and also, and this is important, using metadata provided by our users, which are scientists, the ones that put those instruments. So our application, which is the one that ingests this data, produces a first level of file formats, which is a netcdf file, but then applies a quality control procedures and produces some derived data from those raw data files, and also using this configuration and metadata database. And this in turn produces a second level of curation, which is another netcdf file with some quality control flags. In the end, the main depositors of information of our repository are our own observing facilities and forecasting facilities. They more or less send this data to the associated data repository, and we at the data center manage all this process. So what are our particularities? Most data, as I said, is self-produced. This data is topic related. It is meta-ocean data. So we are not a general archive. And this is something important when you have to create a preservation policy. You have to know if you are going to ingest a general type of data or something quite specific. A small percentage of our data comes from third-party institutions, and this is done through a competitive access program in which we offer our gliders, small submarines, fleet, and our research vessel to third-party institutions so they can use it and produce their own data. But that data, if they want, can be ingested in our repository. And this is more or less the same for the European and national projects we participate on, which have their own particular agreements. So in general, we offer free open access, but we have some few exceptions. For example, to protect the environment of sensitive areas or sensitive species, data that we consider that has a low level of curation, or to protect data which may be related to Spanish strategic interests, like the Navy, or to give a moratorium to this data because a PhD student or a scientist needs some time to publish before distributing this data. So Core Seal certification is important for us right now because of the competitive access and the European and national projects, because those are the ones that we have to provide confidence and to demonstrate that we are trustworthy, so that they want to put their data in our repository. And for the future, it is something crucial if we someday want to become a national ocean data repository. Before starting the certification process, the data repository in SOCIP didn't exist as such. So we had data, we had the concept of a repository, but it was not an entity. There were some managed processes, but they were partially defined. And we really didn't have a clear idea of what a preservation plan and digital preservation consisted of. So the first time we had to work in this, we thought, okay, what's preservation? Is it backups or is it something else? And there was some discussion about this, and the more you go into the details of the CORTA-SIL certification, the more you understand this is not just backups. It is the whole process, the whole having documented all the processes from ingestion to publication, and also the long-term preservation. But luckily, since 2018, we've been working on a data management program based on the data management maturity model of the CMMI Institute to organize all these processes and documentation we had in SOCIP. And this is quite aligned to what the CORTA-SIL certification needs. So there was some work already being done, ongoing work, but there was some work left. So the process of gathering the information consisted on creating working groups. The staff that was involved was mainly the data center and computer and IT service and direction. Just to give you an idea, SOCIP is more or less 40 workers. And the data center, we are around 8 to 10 people. It is a small team compared to some other institutions. So we started creating one single document for each requirement, and we started to answering the questions from the CORTA-SIL guide to have an overview of what we had and what we didn't. And the persons who had the knowledge on each of those requirements were participating on. That helped us to identify gaps and weaknesses we had, and they were mainly we had lots of gaps and weaknesses, but the main ones were the continuity of access and also the preservation plan. But this year we had to create the new strategic plan in SOCIP from the next 4 years, and it was a good opportunity to align these needs and gaps that we detected to incorporate them into our strategy. So what's the preservation plan? What CORTA-SIL wants from you? So the repository assumes the responsibility for long-term preservation and manages this function in a planned and documented way, and this is quite important. We identified that we were doing some preservation-related actions. We were doing preservation, but it was barely documented in separate and internal documents, such as computing and IT had their IT infrastructure, workflows and documentation, their backups policy. We were working on our data management plans. There were some quality control procedures and other manuals, but that was not enough. It was not, we didn't have a plan or a strategy. So at this moment we were like, Houston, we have a problem. Can we really apply without having such a plan? because that sounds a lot of work. And the short answer is yes, you can apply, but you have to provide evidence that you are doing something in regard, and also to explain that you are working on creating such a plan. So keep calm and make a plan. Okay, so we started to work on our preservation plan, and the first thing related to that was the workshop from FAIRsFAIR in February this year, and it was quite helpful to understand the needs that the things that we had to work on. They gave us a worksheet with a lot of questions and things and topics that we had to answer, and that helped a lot to identify what we had. So how we faced the blank paper, how we started the work on this plan. We took a look at what DANS and the UKVA were doing, their preservation plans. So don't reinvent the wheel, don't pretend to do something from scratch. I took a look at their preservation plans, and I saw that they more or less had like more or less the same structure, not necessarily. Your preservation policy doesn't have to be like this. You have to. Everyone has a different preservation policy, but having such a structure helped us to start working. And also, I identified that some of these chapters were related to some specific requirements. So the effort we did for the rest of the requirements was reused in here. Things that we think that we have to take into consideration. The information from other requirements of the Cortra Seal certification can and I think that it has to be used to write the preservation plan. It has to be consistent. The practical day-to-day implementation, how you do things specifically and who does what, that goes in other documents. This is an overview, and a strategy, a plan. I'd say that it is not necessary, but it helps using the OAIS model and specifically their concepts. So, for example, functions. What's the pre-ingestion? What do you do before ingesting the data, the ingestion, the archival, and also the information packages and the preferred formats. What are the submission information packages? So what's the format, or what's the data that your users are going to give you? What's an archival information package? What are you going to archive? And what are you going to disseminate? So this terminology helps to have discussions with the rest of the team. And also you have to define, how do you are you going to preserve all these things? Are they all accessible? In our case, they are not all accessible. So going back to our ingestion, we detected that the raw files, in our case, were submission information packages and also archiving information packages, because we store them. But we don't disseminate them. We disseminate the netcdf files, which are the good data once it is standardized. So what is expected from the applicants? Preservation isn't, as I said, is not just backups. It is the whole process and having documented processes, a policy, and a model. You have to have a clear idea of the status of your preservation plan whether you have it or not. It is fine to say, okay, we don't have a preservation plan as such, but we are doing this, this, and this, and we plan to have a plan in some time. In fact, this is what we do, what we did the first time we applied. And they said, fine, it's fine, but you have to, we have to be sure that you are doing this. So now we are finishing our preservation plan, and it's not so important if it's finished or not, but we are going to give them at least the draft. And as I said, I think it's better to create a plan following a model such as the OAIS. And please provide evidence. The reviewers said that we were saying that we were doing things, but we didn't provide evidence in some cases. And the results are quite good for us, I think, because this whole certification process boosted up the internal documentation and improved the internal processes. It helped us to detect weaknesses and also strength, things that we were already doing well and we didn't know. And the main thing, I think, is that the associate data repository has become an entity. Now we have a landing page just for the repository that concentrates all the information, also licenses, manuals, data policy, preservation plan, and we want to put it there. So the expectations now are, of course, obtaining the Cortazil certification. I think we are quite close, given the feedback from the reviewers, and we plan to apply for the second time in 1 month, let's say. The national impact, we want to align with Digital CSIC, which is the main Spanish institution in this regard. Is the main repository in science in Spain, which already has the certification. And we also want to become a repository of reference in marine data. Internationally, we want to improve interoperability. We also want to become an IOD associate data unit, which is more related to ocean data. And also we want to, thanks to this, become a regular member of the World Data System, and also to being able to provide best practices and contribute in data management. And that's it. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks very much, Miguel. That was really good to hear, a very kind of frank and open review of the whole process. I think, you picked up on some really good points. I think, obviously it took a lot of effort for you to go through this process, but I think it was great that you pointed out that it did show up some weaknesses, but it also highlighted some strengths that you hadn't been aware of. So I think that's good to take on board. And I think, it's also great to see that you put a big evidence kind of driven approach to this. So you don't have to have the final plan just yet. You can start to think about this as a living process. But I think, it's all about having that clarity and providing the evidence that you are doing something. And while I think that's obviously core for anybody who is going for core trust seal certification, you have to provide this evidence. I think it's just generally good practice for any repository to have transparency around your processes and providing evidence, because it gives people confidence in the services that you're doing and being open about how you are actually preserving the content that people are sharing. So I think we do have a question in the chat from Alan Morrison, and he was asking you, Miguel, just for a little bit more on the basic technical repository system that you have at your organization.
Okay. Well, actually, it has so many parts. Regarding the ingestion, as I said, we have some internal tools, internal software that we develop. Well, I am the one of the main developers of this software, and we parts of these different formats in-house, and we also have we have the different facilities. They have the knowledge to tell us what each the format means. This is a Java application that's running constantly and receiving data from satellite and from many other ways. And then this data is put on a file system, internal file system, and published through a Threads data server, which is a common web application to publish ocean data. We also have another web application, which is called the data catalog. I can provide you with the links if you want. That is a more user-friendly way to access the data in the repository. And the third way to access our data is through an API, so that you can create an application that automatically connects and uses this data. I don't know if this answers your question.
Yeah, hopefully that gave you a bit of a response, Alan. So if there's anything else, feel free to unmute if you've got any other questions. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Oh, so Alan's just clarifying. So yeah, self-built rather than out of the box. And I think that's interesting. Do you find that it was more difficult going through the Core Trust Seal certification process because it was a self-built system, and did you have to provide more evidence on all of the different components than maybe you would have had to have done with something that's off the shelf?
It depends on how you work. I mean, while you are developing your own software, you document that software and the processes and all this. I think it's more or less the same. On the other hand, if you have a standard web server or application, of course you can reuse some documentation from that. But the main thing that I think that helped us, it was starting to work with the data management program, because that's something in general for any entity that helps you to organize the processes.
Great, perfect. Well, hopefully that has answered your question. I think Alan's just saying you're lucky to have great in-house technical support. So that also, I dare say, helps a lot. So yeah. I think we are getting very close to the end of the hour. So I think I'll just take a couple of minutes just to wrap up. So thanks very much to everybody for joining today. I hope that you found, during this short session, a little bit of information that was useful to you. I've just pulled out a couple of points that I think might be worth highlighting. And I think the first one is, I think Hervé mentioned, it's not on my slide here, but preservation is all about reuse. So we're not just looking to have a preservation plan and policy for the sake of it. It really should be something that is actually going to enable future access and reuse. So that's always good to bear in mind. It's also worth bearing in mind that digital preservation, while we've been looking today at the context of digital preservation in relation to Core Trust Seal certification, it is a core function for all repositories. That's the reason repositories exist, is to provide sustained access to data over time. So bear that in mind, whether you're going for certification or not. Digital preservation is a core function, and it's essential for keeping data fair over time. So it's going to be an increasingly crucial part of the ecosystem for us to have more trustworthy digital repositories to use. This notion of trustworthy repositories, it is often tied up with certified repositories, but it doesn't always have to mean certified. Trustworthiness can come through a range of repository actions, and quite often that is about being transparent and having that evidence that people can look at. So again, it's not all tied up with certification. Repositories can do an awful lot to demonstrate this level of trustworthiness and a commitment to preservation by just being more open and transparent about what you're doing and sharing some of that evidence that we've heard about. I think Hervé's point about the core trust seal approach, I think somebody had mentioned earlier in the chat that they don't have a preservation policy as a dedicated policy, but it is addressed in other organizational policies. And I think that was good to pick up from your talk, Hervé, the fact that the label is less important to core trust seal than the content. So if that content is covered somewhere else, it is actually acceptable, and it's up to the organization or the repository to decide exactly what's the right approach for you. I think a couple of last points really there I just wanted to pick up is that Lena shared quite a few links to some policy tools that have been developed in FAIRsFAIR. Most of these are building on other resources from the Digital Preservation Coalition and others. So we have linked to them in the slides, and they're already available online. So please feel free to go and explore some of those. As Miguel mentioned, you don't have to start from scratch. I think it's better if you don't start from scratch, make use of some of these free tools wherever you can. And I think the last one I just wanted to end on, and I think it's quite important, don't write your plan or your policy in isolation. It involves input from lots of different operational units across your repository service, but also thinking about your end users and your designated communities. So communication and consultation are going to be really important. So do make sure that you build those into your activities as well. So with that, I think all that is left for me to do is to say thank you very much to all of the speakers for sharing your talks today. I found them really useful. And thank you to all of you for joining today and taking an hour out of your day to join us. We will, as I said, be adding the recording to the event website, but you should have already access to the slides, so feel free to start exploring those in the meantime. So thank you very much, and hope you have a good rest of your week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.